Hello, this is part 51, preparation for NSE4 exam, Fortinet. Let's talk about selecting multiple interfaces or any interface. By default, we can select only a single interface as the incoming interface, and the single interface as an outgoing interface. This is because the option to select multiple interfaces or any interface in the firewall policy is disabled on the graphical user interface. However, we can enable multiple interface policies option on the feature visibility page, and it will disable the single interface restriction. We can also specify multiple interfaces or use any option if we configure a firewall policy on the CLI, regardless of the default graphical user interface setting. It is also worth mentioning that even when we choose the any interface option, we cannot select multiple interfaces for that interface. So because any is selected as outgoing interface, we cannot add any additional interfaces because any interface implies that all interfaces have already been selected. The next match criteria that FortiGate considers is packets source. Matching by source. In each firewall policy, we must select the source address object. Optionally, we can refine our definition of the source address by also selecting a user or a user group, which provides a much more granular match for increased security. We can also select ISDB, Internet Services Database objects, as source in the firewall policy, which we will study how to do it. When selecting a fully qualified domain name, FQDN, as a source address, it must be resolved by DNS, domain name service, and cached in FortiGate. Make sure that FortiGate is configured properly for DNS settings. If FortiGate is not able to resolve a FQDN, fully qualified domain name address, it will present a warning message, and the firewall policy configured with that FQDN will not match properly. If a user added as part of the source, FortiGate must verify the user before allowing or denying access based on the firewall policy. There are different ways that a user can authenticate. For local users, the username and password is configured locally on FortiGate. When a local user authenticates, the credentials that they enter must match the username and password credentials configured locally on FortiGate. And for the remote user, for example, LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, or Radius server, FortiGate receives username and password from the remote user and then passes this information to the authentication server. The authentication server verifies the user login credentials and updates FortiGate that it is verified, should it accept or deny. After FortiGate receives this information, it grants the network based on the firewall policy. And FSSO, Fortinet single sign-on user's information is retrieved from the domain controller. Access is granted based on the group information on FortiGate. Matching by source, we must specify IP address, range, subnet, FQDN, geography, dynamic, MAC address range, and may specify source user, local firewall policies, accounts on a remote server, for example, Active Directory, LDAP, Radius, Fortinet single sign-on, personal certificate. Access is granted based on group information on FortiGate when FSSO, Fortinet single sign-on, is in use. Matching policy by source. User is an optional object. The user's object is used to make policy more specific. If we want the policy to match more traffic, we would leave the user object undefined. We can also use ISDB, Internet Services Database objects, as source in the firewall policy. There are relationships between Internet Service objects and source addresses objects in firewall policies. And it means that we can select either a source address or an internet service, but not both. Actually, what we can choose in policy and object, we choose firewall policy, and there we can choose address or user or internet services, but we cannot put all of them. Matching policy by destination. Like the packet source, FortiGate also checks the destination address for a match. We can use address objects or Internet Services Database objects as destination in the firewall policy. The address object may be a host name, IP, subnet, or range. If we either FQDN, fully qualified domain name, put it as an address object, then we must make sure that we've configured our FortiGate device with DNS services, domain name services. FortiGate uses DNS to resolve those fully qualified domain names, those host names, to IP addresses that appear in the IP header. We can also choose geographical addresses, which are groups or ranges of addresses that are assigned to a country. FortiGuard is used to update these objects. Why there is no option to select a user? Because you remember when we specified source, we could specify also not only IP addresses, FQDN, subnet, we could also specify user, but here we cannot specify user for destination. The user identification is determined at the ingress interface, incoming interface, and the packets are forwarded only to egress interface after the user is successfully authenticated. Matching by internet services. Internet service regularly updated through FortiGuard. Internet service is a database that contains a list of IP addresses, IP protocols, and port numbers used by the most common internet services. FortiGate periodically downloads the newest version of the database from FortiGuard. We can select this as source or destination in the firewall policy. What will happen if we allow traffic only to a few well-known public internet destinations, such as Dropbox or Facebook? When configuring our firewall policy, we can use Internet service as destination in firewall policy, which contains all IP addresses, ports, and protocols used by that service. For the same reason, we cannot mix regular address objects with Internet Services Database objects, ISDB objects, and we cannot select services on a firewall policy. The ISDB objects are already objects that have services information, which is hard-coded. Compared with address objects, which we need to check frequently to make sure that none of the IP addresses have changed or appropriate ports are allowed, Internet services helps make this type of deployment easier and simpler. Next, geographic-based Internet service database. Geographic-based ISDB objects allows users to define a country, region, a city. These objects can be used in firewall policies for more granular control over the location of the parent ISDB object, Internet Service Database object. Internet Services Database objects are referenced in policies by name instead of by ID. To check it, we go to Graphical User Interface, Policy and Objects, and then choose Internet Service Database. There, on the tab on the right, you can see at the end there is a sign like an eye, and you can view or edit entries. We can disable ISDB updates so they occur only during a change control window. Once Internet Services Database updates are disabled, other scheduled FortiGuard updates for IPS, intrusion prevention systems, AV, antivirus, and so on, and do not update ISDB. By default, ISDB updates are enabled. Schedules and matching by service and scheduling. Schedules add time element to the policy. For example, we might use a policy to allow backup software to activate at night or create a test window for a remote address that is allowed for testing purposes. Schedules can be configured and used in a 24-hour time clock. There are a few configuration settings worth mentioning. First, recurring. If we enable all-day, traffic will be allowed for 24 hours for the days selected. When configuring recurring schedules, if we set the stop time earlier than the start time, the stop time will occur the next day. For example, if we select Sunday as the day and 10 o'clock in the morning as a start time and 9 o'clock as a stop time, the schedule will stop on Monday at 9 o'clock in the morning. And if the start and stop time are identical, the schedule will run for 24 hours. One time, it means that it happens only once, and the start time and finish time, they should be in when we enable pre-expiration event log. We can generate an event log several times and a number of days before the schedule expires, where n can be from 1 day to 100 days. One time start and daytime must be earlier than the stop time, and it is configured in policy and objects on graphical user interface. Select schedules. Another selection criteria that FortiGate uses to match policies is the packets service. At the IP layer, protocol numbers, for example, TCP, UDP, SCTP, and other protocols, together with source and destination ports, define each network service. Generally, only a destination port, that is, the server listening port, is defined. Some legacy applications may use a specific source port, but in most common modern applications, the source port is randomly identified as transmission time and therefore is not a reliable way to define the services. For example, the predefined service object named HTTP is TCP destination port 80, and the predefined service object named HTTPS is TCP destination port 443. However, the source ports last for only a short time, and therefore source ports are not defined. By default, services are grouped together to simplify administration by categories. If the predefined services don't meet our organizational needs, we can create one or more new services, service groups, and categories. Checking our knowledge. Couple of questions. What criteria does FortiGate use to match traffic to a firewall policy? Is it source and destination interfaces or security profiles? And the correct answer is source and destination interfaces. Question 2. What must be selected in the source field of a firewall policy? At least one source user and one source address object, or at least one address object or ISDB? And the correct answer is at least one address object or ISDB. Next, we will study configuring firewall policies. We will talk about configuring firewall policies in our next video. Thank you.